The silent embargo, WHY the West is losing the global resource struggle. Imagine waking up in a London flat or a cottage in the Cotswolds, only to find that the future has been cancelled. Your smartphone won't charge, your electric vehicle is a 3-ton paperweight, and the advanced medical scanners at the local NHS hospital have gone dark. This isn't a plot from a dystopian novel. It is the cold, hard reality of the strategic shift currently unfolding. On the 14th of January 2025, the global supply chain shifted on its axis. Beijing didn't just impose a tariff or a minor trade restriction. They pulled the ultimate lever, a total export ban on rare earth processing technology. In a heartbeat, billions of pounds of Western technological infrastructure became a ticking clock. From the high-tech hubs of Manchester to the Silicon Valley, the lifeblood of modern industry, semiconductors, AI, and green energy, is now hanging by a thread controlled entirely by the East. But here is the truth that politicians in Westminster and Washington are hesitant to admit: this was not a surprise. It is the third act of a 4-stage pattern that has dismantled every dominant economic power in history. Welcome to the era of great industrial decoupling. We brought a credit card to a resource fight, and we are just now realizing the shop is closed. The 4 stages of collapse, a historical blueprint. History does not care for your optimism or your share prices. It follows a brutal, repetitive cycle. To understand why we are staring into the abyss today, we must look at the pattern that broke Rome and humbled the British Empire. Stage 1. Dominance through production. Every rising power begins by making things. Real things. Steel, ships, microchips, and batteries. In this stage, a nation doesn't care about optimizing quarterly returns for shareholders. It cares about leverage. According to data from the International Energy Agency, IEA, China's rise over the last 40 years has been a masterclass in Stage 1. They didn't just outsource, they built. Today, they don't just mine materials, they control the very alchemy required to make them useful. While we were busy designing sleek apps, they were perfecting the industrial processing of neodymium and dysprosium. They understood a fundamental truth: the one who controls the raw materials controls the world. Stage TWO, the trap of financialization. This is where the incumbent power, that's us, gets comfortable. We decide that manufacturing is dirty, expensive, and low margin. We decide it is far more sophisticated to trade financial derivatives than to forge steel. Take the UK and the US as prime examples. In the 1970s, manufacturing accounted for roughly 25 to 28% of GDP in these nations. Today, according to the World Bank, that figure has plummeted to around 10 to 11%. We replaced factories with professional services, hedge funds, and complex insurance schemes. The spreadsheets looked magnificent. The stock markets hit record highs. But as we moved production offshore to cut costs, we didn't just export jobs. Chung ta da zuat kao ca chu gwin chien luok kwa min. We became dependent. Not just for cheap toys, but for the very components of our national defense. The British Empire made this exact mistake in the late 19th century. British capital flowed into Argentinian railways and American steel mills because the returns were better than upgrading the aging mills in Lancashire. By 1914, the Royal Navy, the pride of the empire, discovered they were dependent on German optical systems for their rangefinders. They were forced to fight a war using the technology of their greatest rival. Does that sound familiar? It should. Because today, the Ministry of Defense and the Pentagon are in the exact same position. The modern reality, a house of cards. Let's look at the numbers, verified by the U.S. Geological Survey, USGS. China currently controls nearly 90% of the global processing capacity for rare earth elements. Think about that for a moment. Every F-35 Lightning II jet requires roughly 190 kilograms of these materials to fly. Every Virginia-class submarine needs over 4 tons. We are building our most advanced China deterrent weaponry using materials that only China can provide. This isn't just a supply chain issue, it is strategic insanity. We are currently deep in Stage 2, drifting into the shadow of Stage 3. We have financialized our way into a corner where our wealth is digital, but our needs are physical. And the physical world is now being locked down. Stage 3, the leverage event. When the bill comes due, we are now standing at the precipice of Stage 3. In the world of geopolitics, this is known as the leverage event. It is the moment the rising power, the one that has spent decades sweating in factories while the incumbent power spent decades shuffling papers, realizes it holds all the cards. In our modern context, the 2020s will be remembered as the decade of the Great Realization. Whether it is the export restrictions on gallium and germanium or the 2025-2026 total ban on rare earth processing tech, the message from Beijing is clear: you have the financial instruments, but we have the physical reality. Western leaders thought they could control the world through the SWIFT banking system and the dominance of the dollar and the pound. But you cannot build a microchip out of a treasury bond, and you cannot power a national grid with credit default swaps. Stage 3 is where the incumbent power discovers that you cannot print your way out of a material shortage. The Roman mirror, a warning from the 3rd century. To see where this ends, we must look at Rome. Not the Rome of the history books with glinting swords and invincible legions, but the Rome of the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, an empire that had effectively outsourced its own survival. At its peak, Rome was the ultimate consumer. It didn't need to mine its own silver or grow its own grain. Why bother? They had conquered Egypt to be their breadbasket. They had Spain for silver and Gaul for iron. The Roman citizen became a creature of leisure and administration. The Roman elite became masters of financialization, devaluing their currency, the denarius, to pay for an empire they could no longer physically sustain. Historical records from the era show a terrifying trend. As the provinces realized Rome was entirely dependent on them, they began to withhold. The grain ships from Alexandria started arriving late, then not at all. The Germanic tribes didn't just raid, they learned to forge their own weapons, using the very techniques Rome had once mastered but subsequently forgotten. The parallel to our modern situation is haunting. Rome outsourced grain to Egypt, we outsource semiconductors to Taiwan. Rome outsourced metalwork to the provinces, we outsourced rare earth processing to China. Rome devalued the denarius until it was merely copper with a silver wash. The West has expanded the money supply, M2, by trillion since 2020, hoping the world wouldn't notice the lack of underlying production. By the time the Visigoths reached the gates of Rome in 410 AD, the empire wasn't defeated by a superior military strategy. It was defeated by a broken purchase order. Rome had the gold, but there was nothing left to buy. The workshop of the world had moved, and Rome was no longer invited. The semiconductor trap, 130 miles from collapse. Let's bring this back to the present day with some hard data. We often hear about the CHIPS Act and the billions being spent to bring manufacturing back to the UK and the US. But here is the reality check. According to the Semiconductor Industry Association, the US share of global chip manufacturing has fallen from 37% in 1990 to just 12% today. And if we look at the leading-edge chips, the brains behind AI and advanced weaponry, that number is effectively zero. 100% of the world's most advanced semiconductors are manufactured by TSMC in Taiwan. Taiwan sits just 130 miles from mainland China. 130 miles is all that separates our entire technological civilization from a total blackout. Even if we build factories, fabs, in Arizona or the West Midlands, we are still caught in a circular dependency. These fabs require high-purity chemicals from Japan, precision machinery from the Netherlands, ASML, and, crucially, processed rare earth dopants from China. We have spent 40 years building a just-in-time supply chain that is actually a just-at-their-mercy supply chain. We optimized for efficiency, but in doing so, we sacrificed our resilience. We are living in a house of cards, and stage 3 is the wind beginning to blow. The British tragedy, from The World's Workshop to The World's Bank. If we want to see the future of the West, we only need to look at our own history. In the mid-19th century, Britain was the undisputed workshop of the world. If you wanted a steam engine, a railway line, or high-grade steel, you bought British. There was no alternative. We didn't just have the money, we had the smokestacks, the engineers, and the sheer industrial grit of Manchester, Glasgow, and Birmingham. But then, stage 2 set in, a subtle, seductive poison. British investors discovered that it was far more profitable to finance a railway in Argentina or a steel mill in Pennsylvania than to reinvest in a factory in Sheffield. Financial returns on colonial debt were higher than the margins on domestic manufacturing. By the 1870s, the rot had started. We embraced the doctrine of comparative advantage, the idea that if someone else can make it cheaper, we should let them, while we focus on high-value banking and insurance in the City of London. By 1910, the results were catastrophic. Britain was importing steel from its rivals. And in 1914, at the outbreak of the Great War, the Royal Navy, the most powerful force on the planet, found itself in a humiliating position. Our rangefinders, the very eyes of our battleships, relied on precision optical glass from Zeiss, a German company. We were literally dependent on our enemy to see them clearly enough to fire. Britain only survived the war because American production capacity stepped in to save us. We had the gold reserves, but we had lost the ability to churn out shells fast enough to stay in the fight. We traded our industrial soul for financial dividends, and it nearly cost us everything. The 1956 Suez Crisis was merely the final signature on the death warrant of British hegemony, the moment we realized that without the ability to produce and the energy to fuel it, our financial power was nothing more than a polite fiction. The Japanese gamble, the lesson in resource starvation now. Look at the other side of the coin, Japan in 1941. Japan had mastered stage 1, they had the factories and the technology. But they had a fatal flaw: zero raw materials. No oil, no rubber, no iron. In July 1941, the United States pulled the trigger on a total oil embargo. Japan was left with 18 months of reserves. Their choice was binary: accept subordination to American terms, effectively ending their dream of empire, or embark on a high-stakes campaign to secure the critical energy basins of Southeast Asia. They chose the path of confrontation. Admiral Yamamoto famously warned his government that Japan could run wild for 6 months, but after that, they would be crushed by the sheer weight of American industrial production. He was exactly right. At the peak of the struggle, the US was launching a new Liberty ship every 2 days. Japan couldn't even replace the carriers they lost at Midway. The lesson for us today is brutal: you cannot win a material-based struggle against the nation that controls the materials and has 10 times the manufacturing capacity. In 1941, that was America. In 2026, that is China. The myth of financial supremacy. We have been told for decades that our service-based economy is a sign of maturity. We are told that intellectual property is more valuable than heavy industry. This is a lie. Money is a claim on wealth, it is not wealth itself. If the person holding the physical goods decides they no longer want your pieces of paper or your digital digits, your wealth evaporates instantly. We see this today in the West's struggle to supply Ukraine. Despite having a combined GDP dozens of times larger than Russia's, the entire NATO alliance has struggled to match the artillery shell production of a single, highly industrialized rival. Why? Because we have the money, but we no longer have the machine tools, the chemical plants, or the skilled workforce. We have spent 40 years building what can only be described as a paper empire. We have cultivated the world's finest legal minds, the most meticulous accountants, and the most sophisticated financial architects in the city. However, we are now discovering a sobering truth: you cannot safeguard national interests with a contract alone, and you cannot build a green industrial revolution using only a spreadsheet. Stage 3 represents the definitive moment when the global market stops accepting our financial promises and starts demanding the physical reality we can no longer provide. Stage 4, the binary choice, subordination or survival. As we move through 2026, we have entered the final, most dangerous phase of the cycle, Stage 4. History tells us there are no third paths here. When an incumbent power loses control of its production base and its resources, it faces a binary choice: to accept a fundamental loss of strategic autonomy, or to engage in total systemic friction to preserve the existing global order. Let's be brutally honest about what subordination looks like in the 21st century. It doesn't involve foreign soldiers marching down Whitehall or the Mall. It is far more subtle. It is an economic and technological straitjacket. It means that when Apple or Tesla, companies that are the bedrocks of Western pension funds, need to manufacture their next generation of products, they must first ensure their strategy aligns with Beijing's interests. According to Bloomberg supply chain analysis, despite de-risking efforts, over 80% of critical components for Western green tech still originate from or pass through Chinese hands. Subordination means our foreign policy is no longer dictated by our values, but by our need to keep the lights on and the assembly lines moving. We have effectively traded our sovereignty for a steady supply of lithium and neodymium. The strategic deadlock, the limits of modern sustainability. The alternative to reindustrialization is a strategic deadlock, and here the mathematics are even more grim. For decades, Western doctrine has relied on quality over quantity. We have the most sophisticated jets, the quietest submarines, and the most advanced systems. However, recent studies from the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, have highlighted a sobering reality. In a high-intensity strategic confrontation with a peer competitor, the sustainability of our technical stockpiles would likely be measured in weeks, not months. Why? Because we have optimized our industry for peacetime efficiency, sacrificing long-term resilience. We operate on just-in-time logistics. Even worse, as the global shifts of 2025 to 2026 have shown, we cannot rapidly scale production because the vital sensors and components required for these systems depend on rare earth elements currently under strategic restriction. You cannot maintain a position of strength against the world's largest factory when that factory is also your primary supplier. The erosion of that exorbitant privilege. This crisis is now reaching our domestic economies. For 80 years, the US dollar and the British pound have enjoyed what economists call exorbitant privilege. We could maintain our standards of living because the world required our currency for global trade. But as the global manufacturing core shifts and new payment systems like CIPS emerge, that structural demand is cooling. If we can no longer produce the goods the world wants, and we no longer control the resources the world needs, the value of our paper empire faces an inevitable reckoning. The persistent inflation of recent years isn't just a temporary glitch, it is the market realizing that a currency backed by debt cannot indefinitely compete with a currency backed by industrial capacity. The final ultimatum, a rebirth of production. Is it too late? Perhaps. But there is one path remaining, and it requires a total psychological shift. We must abandon this financialization model that has gutted our nation since the 1980s. Strategic reindustrialization. We must treat rare earth processing and semiconductor fabrication not as business opportunities, but as national infrastructure, no different from our roads or our water supply. The UK government's recent investment in the Teesside Freeport and magnet recycling is a start, but it is a drop in the ocean. We need a national security priority for industrial policy. Resource realism. We must stop pretending that the market will solve strategic dependencies. Private companies will always choose the cheapest supplier, which is often a rival. National security must override quarterly profit margins. Skills over speculation. We need to steer our brightest minds away from the high-frequency trading floors of the city and back into materials science, high-end engineering, and chemical processing. The era of the paper empire is over. The events of early 2025 were the opening bell for a new world order. We can either manage a graceful decline, or we can choose to become the inventors, the builders, and the makers once again. History is watching. And as Rome and the British Empire of old found out, history is a judge that does not accept excuses, only results. The shop is closing, and it's time we started making our own tools again.